The first time I noticed something off was on a Saturday evening, when Sophie was at her usual yoga class. I'd spent the day cleaning out the garage, which was long overdue. The house was quiet, and I decided to sit down and check my emails, something I rarely did outside of work. It wasn't a big deal, just a habit to catch up with the world beyond the walls of our home. But as I scrolled through the inbox, something caught my eye. It was an unusual notification on Sophie's phone. She hadn't been using it much that day, which was odd. Normally, she'd be glued to it, scrolling through Instagram, replying to texts, or whatever she did on it. I reached for it without thinking much. Maybe it was the silence of the house, the stillness of the moment that felt too heavy. The message that appeared wasn't from one of her friends or family, like I expected. No, this was from Ryan Mitchell. I'd heard the name before. Ryan was a guy she met during one of her weekend art classes a few months ago. He was older, well-spoken, and obviously in great shape. At first, I thought nothing of it. Sophie always told me how nice and friendly he was, and how he was always so supportive during the class, always giving her feedback on her paintings. A lot of it sounded harmless. But this message, this was something different. Can't wait to see you tomorrow, babe. Let's make it special like last time. That one sentence hit me harder than I could ever explain. It wasn't flirtation anymore. It wasn't a casual, hey, how's it going, kind of message. It was personal, intimate, and worse, it was signed with babe. I didn't know how long I sat there, staring at the screen. I felt a tightness in my chest, an overwhelming wave of nausea. My heart raced as I replayed it over and over in my mind. Babe? It was so intimate, so casual. Sophie hadn't called me that in months. The rational part of my brain tried to reason with me. Maybe it was an innocent message. Maybe it was a joke, a playful exchange. But the instinct inside me was gnawing at the edge of my mind, telling me it wasn't. There was something there. Something I had to find out. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the seed was planted. The next few days were torture. Sophie was her usual self, sweet, caring, and affectionate, but I couldn't stop thinking about that message. I kept replaying it, trying to figure out what it meant. Was there more to it? Had something happened between them? The questions circled in my mind like a tornado. I began to watch Sophie more closely. Her late nights at work, the sudden interest in her appearance, the time she went to the gym without telling me where she was going. I couldn't help myself. I had to know. That night, after Sophie fell asleep, I began searching through her phone. It was wrong. I knew that. I knew I was crossing a line, but I didn't care. The feeling of betrayal had already taken root in my chest, and I needed to confirm it, needed to know the truth. I scrolled through her messages, but there was nothing else that stood out. No other texts from Ryan, no calls, no late-night chats. Maybe it was just that one message. But then, something else caught my attention. There was a photo album, one that hadn't been there before. I'd seen her albums in the past, filled with family pictures, vacation shots, and artsy photos she took during her weekend trips. But this album was different. It was private, locked with a password. I don't know what made me do it, but I knew the password. I'd seen her type it enough times to remember. It was a combination of numbers that she used for everything, and the second I entered it, the album opened. Inside, there were pictures. Pictures of Sophie and Ryan. Photos from her recent art trip, a weekend retreat where she'd gone on her own. I hadn't thought anything of it. She'd come back glowing, excited about the new techniques she'd learned, gushing about how beautiful the setting had been. But the photos didn't match the story. In the first picture, Sophie was sitting on a bench with Ryan, her head resting on his shoulder. It looked too intimate, too comfortable. The next one was even worse. Sophie and Ryan were standing close, arms around each other, their faces pressed together as they laughed. And the third one was taken in a bedroom. Sophie, lying in bed, her hair messy, with Ryan standing beside her, holding her hand. I don't know what hurt more, the pictures or the fact that Sophie had kept them from me. I slammed the phone down, my hands shaking. But it wasn't enough. I needed more. I spent the next few days obsessing over every interaction, every glance Sophie had with Ryan. I knew I couldn't confront her without concrete evidence. So, I made a decision. I had to get more, whatever it took. I hired a private investigator. His name was Marco. He came highly recommended, and his business was discreet. I told him exactly what I needed, gave him the background, and he agreed to help. His job wasn't just to follow Sophie around. It was to track her behavior, document any suspicious interactions, and, if possible, get photographic proof of anything that could indicate infidelity. Over the next few weeks, Marco worked in the shadows. Sophie went about her life, oblivious to the fact that someone was tailing her, snapping pictures, and gathering data. It was subtle, but it was there. I didn't know exactly what he had uncovered, but when I checked in with him, he assured me that he was getting results. One afternoon, he called me. "James," he said, his voice steady but serious. "I've got what you need. I've followed Sophie to a hotel in the city. She checked in with Ryan Mitchell. I've got the receipts, the photos. I'll email them to you." I didn't know how to feel. The anger, the betrayal, it hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't surprised. Not really. But hearing the confirmation, seeing the cold, hard evidence, made it real. It made it irreversible. I couldn't sleep that night. I paced back and forth in the living room, staring at the photos that Marco had sent me. It wasn't just a quick rendezvous. It was more. It was deliberate. They'd planned it. And what really tore me apart was the look on Sophie's face in one of the pictures, the way she was gazing at Ryan as they kissed, the way she had smiled. A smile I had never seen directed at me in years. The next morning, I found myself staring at Sophie while she made breakfast. She hummed as she cracked eggs into a bowl, completely unaware of the storm that was brewing inside of me. The questions I had. Why? What happened? Was I never enough? They all flooded me at once, overwhelming my mind. I watched her, my heart heavy with the truth I could no longer ignore. But I didn't say a word. Not yet. The evidence was undeniable, but I needed more time. Time to figure out what I was going to do next. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the edge of something much bigger than I had ever imagined. A revelation that would change everything. I didn't want to confront Sophie yet. Part of me still hoped there was some misunderstanding, some explanation that would make sense of everything. But deep down I knew the truth was already out there, hanging over me like a dark cloud. The photos from Marco, the private investigator, were enough to shatter the last of my doubts. Sophie entering a hotel with Ryan, those images were damning. I could see her, standing close to him, leaning in, the way she let him take her hand as they walked into that hotel lobby. She knew she was being watched, but she didn't care. The confidence in her steps, the smile that she shared with Ryan, it was as if she were completely free of any guilt. I had the evidence now. I didn't need to guess anymore. But something inside of me screamed for more. I couldn't let her get away with it so easily. I needed to understand the full extent of what was going on, the depth of the betrayal. I needed everything because once I confronted her, there would be no going back. There would be no more questions, no more uncertainty. I had to know exactly what I was dealing with. The next day, I took another step. I had already suspected something was off with the way Sophie had been handling money lately. She had always been meticulous about our finances, always careful with spending. But over the last few months, there had been changes. Little things at first, impulse purchases, things she never would have bought before. A new wardrobe, spa treatments, dining out more often, with no explanation of where the money was coming from. But the big red flag came when I started looking through our joint bank account. At first, it seemed normal enough. I'd been paying the bills, handling the mortgage, all the regular stuff. But then I saw it, 2 charges to the same hotel. A high-end place downtown, one I knew we couldn't afford unless we were spending serious money. The amounts were significant, way more than a night at a hotel should cost. It wasn't just once. The charges were spread across 2 weeks. I scrolled through the dates. The payments lined up perfectly with the times Marco had told me he'd seen them together. The same hotel, the same dates, the same amount. I wasn't even sure what hurt more, the fact that Sophie had been spending money on Ryan without a second thought, or that she had been so reckless about it. She hadn't even tried to hide it. I was the one left in the dark, but everyone else seemed to know. I could feel my hands trembling as I stared at the screen. I was drowning in evidence, drowning in the realization that this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. This was an affair. A full-fledged betrayal that had been going on for who knows how long. My mind started spinning, replaying the moments when I had thought something felt off. The late nights. The sudden changes in her behavior. The way she started going out with friends more often, using excuses about work or needing space when she was really just sneaking around. I had been blind to it all, trusting her too much, giving her too much leeway. I had failed to see the signs. But now, there was no denying it. Sophie had been lying to me. She had been seeing Ryan behind my back, using my trust to cover up her secret life. I wanted to scream, to throw something across the room, but all I could do was sit there, staring at the bank statement, feeling the weight of it crush me. Later that afternoon, Marco sent me more photos, close-ups of Sophie and Ryan, caught on camera in different spots within the hotel. They were laughing, sharing a drink, touching each other in ways that no one should be when they were supposed to be faithful. There was no denying it now. This was more than just a fling. It was an affair, a secret relationship that had been brewing for months, maybe longer. And I had been the fool, the last one to know. I felt a strange numbness wash over me as I looked at the images. It was like I was detached from the situation, unable to process the depth of it all. I had everything I needed now, but it didn't bring me any sense of satisfaction. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like my entire world was crumbling. I couldn't look at Sophie the same way anymore. I didn't confront her right away. I needed time. Time to figure out what to say, what to do. I knew I couldn't go on like this, living in the lies she had built around me. But I wasn't ready to face her yet. The rage was bubbling under the surface, but I didn't want to say something I'd regret. So I spent the night pacing the apartment, staring out the window at the city lights. I could hear Sophie moving around in the bedroom, probably getting ready for bed. She had no idea what was coming. She had no idea that I knew everything. I kept thinking about the times we'd spent together, the vacations, the quiet evenings at home, the moments when I thought we were happy. I thought back to all the times I had trusted her, believed in her. How could she betray me like this? How could she do this to us? I barely slept. When morning came, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't keep letting her get away with this. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when I had proof of her lies staring me in the face. But I wasn't sure if I was ready to hear the truth from her, to listen to the excuses she would inevitably try to make. I didn't know if I could trust her words anymore, no matter what she said. But there was no escaping it now. The truth was here, and it was impossible to ignore. The woman I had built my life with, the woman I thought I knew, had betrayed me in the worst way. The thought of confronting her terrified me, but I knew I couldn't wait any longer. It was time to face the music, to finally get the answers I had been seeking. And as I stood there, holding the photos, the bank statements, the undeniable proof of her infidelity, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I was done being in the dark. The truth was finally mine, and nothing would ever be the same again. The moment I stepped into the kitchen, where Sophie was preparing coffee, everything felt suffocatingly real. She didn't notice me at first, focused on her task, humming lightly as the steam rose from the kettle. I stood there, holding the phone in my hand, the evidence now unmistakable in my mind, yet I couldn't shake the numbness. The truth had been confirmed. She had been lying to me, betraying me with Ryan, and there I was, standing just feet away from her. She looked up, her face lighting up with that easy smile she always gave me in the mornings. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft and warm. I could barely stand the sound of it anymore. Good morning? I thought. How many mornings had we shared like this, oblivious to the lies behind those eyes? I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. It felt like the air had thickened, like I was breathing through water. I glanced at the coffee machine, the counter, anything but her, as the weight of the moment settled into my chest. She started to ask if I wanted cream in my coffee, but I interrupted her. "I know," I said flatly, my voice calm but tight. Sophie paused, her hand hovering over the cream jug. "What?" she asked, confused, like I had just spoken a foreign language. "I know about you and Ryan," I said, my voice steady, though my insides were trembling. I know everything. The hotel. The texts. The photos. Her face went pale. For a moment, she froze, her hands still gripping the jug, her fingers trembling just slightly. Then, slowly, she set it down and turned to face me, her expression faltering. I could see the panic start to creep into her eyes, the realization that the facade was about to crumble. You've been lying to me, Sophie, I continued, my voice rising just a little. For months. I found the bank statements, the charges, the photos. You can't deny it anymore. It's all right here. I took a step forward, holding up the phone. I'd already scrolled through the images countless times, but now they felt like a burden, heavy in my hand as I thrust it toward her. Her gaze dropped to the phone, and for a moment, she seemed frozen. The silence between us was suffocating. I waited, watching as she took in the undeniable proof, the images of her and Ryan at the hotel, laughing, touching, and sharing intimate moments. Her lips quivered, but she didn't speak right away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she looked up at me, her voice barely above a whisper. James, please? I didn't mean for it to happen this way. I felt a sharp pang in my chest, but I pushed it aside. Didn't mean for it to happen? I wanted to shout, to tear into her, but I couldn't lose control. Not now. Not when I had waited so long for this moment. You didn't mean for it to happen? I repeated, my voice icy. What, Sophie? You didn't mean to fall in love with him? You didn't mean to sneak behind my back, to use our money to hide it? You didn't mean to betray me? Is that your excuse? Her eyes welled up with tears, and she took a step toward me. I never wanted to hurt you. You have to believe me. Her voice cracked as she spoke, but it felt rehearsed, like she was trying to salvage something that was already lost. I stepped back, the weight of her words settling into my chest, but there was no compassion left for her. No more understanding. You've already hurt me, Sophie, I said, my voice cold and final. And you can't take that back. She reached out to touch my arm, but I pulled away, the action sharp, almost instinctive. Please, she begged, her eyes desperate now. I made a mistake. It was a mistake. I was lonely, James. We were drifting apart and Ryan, he made me feel seen, wanted. I wasn't looking for this, but it just happened. The words stung, but it was the way she said them. So casual, so full of self-justification, that pushed me over the edge. You were lonely? I repeated, my voice trembling now with frustration. What about me, Sophie? What about everything we had? You think I didn't feel lonely too? You think I didn't notice the distance between us? But I didn't go out and sleep with someone else. I didn't betray you. Her hands shook as she tried to steady herself, tears slipping down her cheeks. I never meant for it to get this far. I love you, James. I do, but I got lost along the way. I didn't know how to fix it. And Ryan, he was there. He listened. He made me feel alive again. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to tear her apart, to let her know just how deep the wound cut. But instead, I swallowed my anger, knowing there was no point. There was nothing she could say that would change what had already happened. You need to leave, I said, my voice low but firm. Now. Her face twisted, a mixture of shock and disbelief. What? James, please. Don't do this. Don't throw everything away over a mistake. I couldn't look at her anymore. Not with the way she was trying to justify it, trying to make me feel like I was the one who was unreasonable. The man she had married was standing right here, begging for the truth. The man who had trusted her, loved her. And yet she couldn't stop making excuses. No, I said, shaking my head. This isn't a mistake, Sophie. This is a betrayal. And I can't forgive that. Not right now. Not ever. She stood frozen for a moment, as if trying to process what I had just said. James, please? She began again, but I cut her off. I'm done, Sophie. This is over. The words hung in the air between us, sharp and final. I felt numb, detached from everything around me, but at the same time, I felt something else. A strange clarity, as if everything had suddenly come into focus. She had betrayed me, and no amount of explanations, no amount of tears, could change that. I need you to leave, I repeated. I can't have you here anymore. Her face crumpled, and she took a step back, as if the weight of what I said had physically hit her. "I'm sorry, James," she whispered, barely audible. "I never meant to hurt you." But I didn't respond. I just stood there watching her. The woman I had loved, the woman who had been my wife, was standing before me, broken and apologetic. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. There was no going back. Sophie stood there for a moment longer, before turning and walking toward the door. I didn't follow her. I didn't try to stop her. I just stood there, in the silence of the kitchen, feeling like my whole world had just shattered into pieces. And as she left, I knew this was the beginning of the end. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I thought I could trust, was gone. And now, so was the life we had built together. It was over. The sound of the front door closing behind Sophie echoed in my ears, the finality of it ringing in my chest. I didn't look back as she left. I didn't watch her walk out of our life. I stayed rooted to the spot in the kitchen, the tension in my body finally beginning to loosen. She was gone. It was almost too quiet after she left. The house felt emptier than it had ever been. Sophie's presence had always filled the space, even when she wasn't here. The hum of her voice, the sound of her footsteps, the faint smell of her perfume lingering in the corners of the house, those little things I used to take for granted. Now all of that was gone. And yet, for the first time in months, I felt a sense of relief. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, not knowing exactly what to do with myself. It was as though a huge weight had been lifted from my chest, but the emptiness still lingered. A strange combination of freedom and sadness settled in my gut. After a while, I took a deep breath and started moving. I didn't want to waste any more time thinking about her. I didn't want to wallow in self-pity. Sophie had made her choice. She had chosen Ryan, chosen her lies, and now I had to choose myself. I needed to take control, to reclaim my life from the wreckage she had left behind. I started with the small things. The things that had once seemed so trivial but now were reminders of the woman who had betrayed me. The little notes she had left on the fridge, the half-empty wine glasses we'd shared during our late-night conversations, the small trinkets she'd bought during our vacations, each one of them a piece of the life we'd shared. I walked to the living room, where the photo frames sat on the mantel. There we were, Sophie and me, in 1,000 different moments. Our wedding day, the first house we bought together, that vacation in Italy we had always talked about, but never went on. I picked up the frame from our wedding day, running my finger over the glass. Her face smiled back at me, the woman I thought I knew so well. But that person was gone. That woman didn't exist anymore. I set the frame down, the glass catching the light in a way that almost made it look like it was alive, like she was still there, but it didn't matter. Sophie was gone, and with her, everything that belonged to her. It was time to move on. The next few hours passed in a blur. I found myself clearing out every part of the house that reminded me of her. The clothes she had left in the closet, the toiletries in the bathroom, even the blankets on the bed. I packed everything into bags, preparing to take them to a storage unit. I couldn't stand the thought of seeing them every day. They felt like chains holding me to a past that was no longer mine. I'd never thought I would be doing this. I never imagined a day would come when Sophie would be gone, when I would have to face the truth of what she had done. But now, standing in the middle of our home, I realized I was stronger than I had given myself credit for. She had been my world, my everything. But she wasn't anymore. As I went through the house, taking down the small things that tied me to her, I realized how little I truly needed them. The photos, the clothes, the objects that had once felt like pieces of a life I had built, they didn't define me. They didn't make me who I was. I was more than that. I was my own person, and I had the power to rebuild from the wreckage of our relationship. I stepped into the bedroom and stopped. The bed. That was the hardest part. It had been our bed for years. I had lain in it with Sophie countless nights, held her close when she cried, made love to her when we felt connected. It had been the one place that still felt like home, even when the rest of our relationship had been falling apart. But now, with her gone, the bed felt foreign, empty. It felt like a reminder of everything that had been lost. I grabbed the sheets and threw them into the laundry. I didn't want to sleep there tonight. I didn't want to be reminded of her, even in the quiet moments when I was alone with my thoughts. There was something cleansing about it. Something cathartic in stripping everything down to the bare walls. The house felt different now. There was a new air to it, like a fresh start. Sophie had left, and so had all the memories that haunted me. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. I stood in the living room, looking at the space I had shared with her, and realized that it no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a blank canvas. I could paint whatever I wanted now. I could rebuild from the ground up. I sat down on the couch, exhausted but strangely at peace. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows across the room. I looked around, really seeing the house for the first time in a long while. It was mine. All mine. And that's when it hit me, the relief. The overwhelming feeling that I had been living under a cloud for so long, and now it was gone. Sophie's departure wasn't just about losing her, it was about reclaiming my own life. For years, I had been drowning in the uncertainty of her betrayal, in the lies, in the pain of not knowing where we stood. But now, that weight was gone. It wasn't a solution to the hurt I felt, but it was the first step toward something new. I wasn't sure what that something would be yet. I didn't know how long it would take to heal, or if I even could heal completely. But I knew this, I was free. Free of the lies. Free of the burden of trying to make sense of her actions. Free to start over. The house was quiet again. The silence was different this time. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful. I didn't need her here anymore. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. I had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could face it. I wasn't broken. I was still whole. And that was enough for now. The day I signed the divorce papers felt like any other day. Sophie wasn't there when I signed them, and that made it easier. I didn't have to look at her face, to hear any more apologies, or listen to the excuses. It was done. Officially. The weight of it didn't hit me immediately. There was no grand moment of closure. It wasn't like the movies, where the character feels a great sense of relief after taking a bold step. Now it was quiet. And maybe that's how it was supposed to be. A part of me wanted to feel angry, wanted to scream at her for everything she had done, but I had already done that in the quiet of my own mind. Now I just had to move on. The first thing I did after signing the papers was to focus on something, anything, that would help me get out of the fog I'd been in for so long. I started with the house. I had spent so many years here with Sophie, building a life, collecting memories. But now, it felt like I was living in someone else's home. The wallpaper that Sophie had chosen, the decor that had once felt like our shared taste, it all reminded me of what had been. It felt like the house itself was holding on to the past. I called in contractors. Over the next few weeks, the house was transformed. It wasn't just about changing the paint on the walls or buying new furniture, it was about reclaiming space, creating a new atmosphere. I needed to feel like this was mine, truly mine. And it worked. Slowly, the place started to feel like a home again. I redesigned the living room to fit my style. I replaced the bedroom furniture, swapped the bed for something larger and more comfortable. I cleared out the garage and turned it into a small gym. Each little change helped clear my mind. I wasn't just renovating the house, I was renovating myself. I also reached out to old friends I hadn't seen in years. People I had lost touch with while I was consumed by my marriage. I reconnected with Paul, a guy I used to play basketball with every weekend. We grabbed a drink one night, caught up on life, and it felt good. It felt right. There was something about sharing a few laughs and talking about the old days that made me realize how much of myself I had forgotten over the years. Sophie had been my whole world, but now, it was time to remember that I had a life outside of her. My friends had been there before and they were still there. I wasn't alone in this, even though it had often felt like it. Work became another anchor for me. As a senior analyst in the banking sector, I had always been good at my job, but I'd never fully invested myself in it. There had always been a part of my mind distracted by Sophie, by the relationship we'd built. But now, with her gone, I threw myself into my career with a renewed sense of purpose. I focused on the numbers, the strategies, the analysis. It gave me a sense of structure in a time when everything else felt uncertain. My manager noticed the change in me. He complimented me on my increased focus, my willingness to take on more responsibility. The promotions I had been passed over for before started to seem more attainable. I wasn't doing it for recognition, but there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing I was excelling in a way I never had before. It wasn't about Sophie anymore. It wasn't about the marriage I had tried so hard to salvage. It was about me. And for the first time in a long time, I felt good about that. There were still hard days. Some mornings, I'd wake up and feel the emptiness, the silence in the house, the fact that there was no one to share my day with. But those moments were becoming fewer. Slowly, I was healing. The pain didn't go away overnight, and maybe it never would. But it became manageable. I found peace in the small things, the quiet mornings with a cup of coffee, the long walks I took around the neighborhood, and the realization that I was still capable of happiness. Sophie's absence, the betrayal, it all stung, but I was beginning to see it as a part of my past, not my future. I had my work, my friends, and my own space. I was rebuilding, and for the first time in a long time, I could finally see a future that was mine to shape.